Utah seek recognition.
Pursuant to House Resolution 682, I move to call up S-139 as reported in the Rules Committee, print 115-53, and ask for its consideration.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 139, an act to implement the use of rapid DNA instruments to inform decisions about pretrial release or detention and their conditions, to solve and prevent violent crimes and other crimes, to exonerate the innocent, to prevent DNA analysis backlogs, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 682, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 115-53 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill as amended shall be debatable for 1 hour with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. After 1 hour of debate on the bill as amended, it shall be in order to consider the further amendment printed in House Report 115-504, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered read, shall be separately debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, each will control 20 minutes. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their marks and include extraneous material on the bill S-139.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of S-139. On January 19th, the FISA Amendments Acts of 2008 will expire. This vital legislation includes Section 702, which permits the government to target foreign citizens located overseas to obtain foreign intelligence information. Section 702 is one of the most, if not the most, critical national security tool used by our intelligence community to obtain intelligence on foreign terrorists located overseas. Now, some claim Section 702 vacuums bulk information without due regard to the intended target. This assertion is simply false. 702 is a targeted program with roughly 106,000 foreign targets worldwide. Given that the worldwide population is about 7.5 billion, this program can hardly be described as bulk collection. Section 702 targets spies, terrorists, weapons proliferators, and other foreign adversaries who threaten the United States, and locating them is crucial to protecting our troops and our homeland. As an example, Haji Aman, who was the second in command of ISIS, was located via Section 702 and later removed from the battlefield. While the vast majority of examples remain classified, this is just one instance that demonstrates the necessity of this authority. Subject to multiple layers of oversight by all 3 branches of government, Section 702 is one of the government's most rigorously overseen foreign intelligence collection authorities. To date, while compliance incidents occur and are dealt with appropriately, there has never been a known intentional abuse of this authority. Nevertheless, the program should be subject to regular adjustments as necessary to ensure the effectiveness of privacy protections. Therefore, after careful consideration of the best way to strengthen privacy protections without hindering the program's effectiveness, the committee supports S-139, a bipartisan bill that includes provisions and addresses concerns raised by the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate. The bill's reforms include requiring specific Section 702 query procedures separate from existing minimization procedures, which must be reviewed by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court every year, limiting the instance in which the government can use Section 702 information to prosecute U.S. people, requiring the Inspector General of the Department of Justice to conduct a review of the FBI's interpretation and implementation of FBI's Section 702 query procedures, temporarily codifying the end of the NSA Section 702 upstream abouts collection until the government develops new procedures and briefs the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. And finally, improving transparency by mandating the publication of Section 702 minimization procedures and requiring additional reporting to Congress on how the intelligence community is using other FISA authorities. During discussion over the past several months, both the House and Senate have made several concessions to achieve this compromise language in order to reauthorize this critical national security authority. Accordingly, S-139 now includes a probable cause-based order requirement for the FBI to access the content and Section 702 communication during FBI criminal investigations on Americans unrelated to national security. This order requirement does not reflect the committee's belief or intent that access to lawfully acquired information constitutes a separate search under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, as interpreted by numerous federal courts, does not require the FBI to obtain a separate order from the FISC to review lawfully acquired 702 information. Though not required by the Constitution, this compromise is meant to provide additional protections for U.S. person information that is incidentally collected under Section 702. Along with the restrictions on the use of Section 702 information on criminal prosecutions, this should provide further assurances to the American public that this vital national security tool is used strictly to discover and mitigate foreign threats to the United States, and the handling of use of any incidental U.S. person information is carefully controlled and monitored. Mr. Speaker, America faces an array of international threats more complicated than anything we've endured in the past. Speaking as for the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, I cannot emphasize enough that now is not the time to draw back on key national security authorities. I am dismayed by the amount of disinformation being propagated by those who oppose Section 702 for purely ideological reasons. When Congress must reauthorize this program again in 2023, we hope those who debate these issues, both inside and outside this chamber, do so with intellectual honesty and integrity. The U.S. Rights Act, which has been offered as an amendment in the nature of substitute, is an attempt to kill this compromise. In its place, the amendment would begin resurrecting the information sharing walls between national security and law enforcement that the 9/11 Commission identified as a major factor in the failure to identify and thwart the 9/11 plot. If individuals in this body cannot learn from history, they are doomed to repeat it. There is no support for this bill in the majority of the committee's jurisdiction, whose members understand that this amendment would render Section 702 inoperable. Therefore, in order to keep the U.S. interests and troops abroad safe from harm, we must ensure that our intelligence community has the tools it needs to provide intelligence to our soldiers abroad. Section 702 is critical in that regard, and S-139 provides the intelligence community with the authorities needed to protect the homeland while implementing key privacy enhancements. I thank the Speaker. I urge passage of S-139 and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
As HPSC's ranking member and a former member of the Judiciary Committee, I've long advocated for reforms to surveillance authorities to balance the imperatives of national security and counterterrorism with the privacy rights and civil liberties of Americans. Today, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act seeks to reauthorize the program while making changes to protect privacy interests. Nonetheless, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated before we took up the bill, in light of the significant concerns that have been raised by members of our caucus and in light of the irresponsible and inherently contradictory messages coming out of the White House today, I would recommend that we withdraw consideration of the bill today to give us more time to address the privacy questions that have been raised, as well as to get a clear statement from the administration about their position on the bill. I do this reluctantly. Section 702, I think, is among the most important of all of our surveillance programs. Nonetheless, I think that the issues that have been raised will need more time to be resolved, and I think we need to get a clear statement from the administration of whether they're in support of this legislation or they're not. This morning, as my colleagues are aware, the President issued a statement via Twitter suggesting that this authority was used illegally by the Obama administration to surveil him. Of course, that is blatantly untrue, but nonetheless casts an additional cloud over the debate today. In light of these circumstances, I think the better course would be for us to defer consideration, give us more time to address the issues that have been raised by the privacy community within my own caucus, but also within the administration about its inaccurate, conflicting, and confusing statements on the morning of debate. So with that, I reluctantly urge my colleagues to postpone consideration so that we can take up this bill when it is more ripe for consideration. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah.
I would like to turn my time over to Chairman Conaway from Texas.
Is the gentleman yielding to the gentleman from Texas to control the time?
Yes, I'd like to yield him 5 minutes. Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank my colleague from Utah. Well, I'm not unappreciative of my colleague from California's comments. I do think we're at a place where we do need to move forward. If we succumb to the emotions of what's going on around us and don't stick to the facts, stick to the what we're trying to get done, then I think that we do that to our detriment. So I have great respect for my colleague and his opinions, but that I personally believe that plays into the emotions of what's going on rather than the facts of what's going on. And if we can just continue to push forward. First, let me say that the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act is a bipartisan compromise bill that preserves the operational flexibility of Section 702 while instituting key reforms to further protect U.S. person privacy. One of the major issues discussed over the past year has been the NSA's Abouts Communication Collection. A tortured title, but nevertheless we'll stick with the phrase Abouts Communication. So Abouts Communications Collection takes place in NSA's upstream collection, and due to how the Internet communications work, allows NSA to collect the communications that may reference a Section 702 target email address. Despite what some of my colleagues may push in their propaganda, Abouts collection does not collect names of targets, just selectors. Some of my colleagues also suggest that Abouts communication is inherently in violation of the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. While the FISA court has raised concerns about Abouts communications collections in the past, NSA has been able to conduct such collection with the approval of the FISA court. This type of collection is at issue today because it was subject to a compliance incident in 2016. NSA self-reported a problem to the FISA court and decided to cease Abouts communication collection until a fix could be implemented and demonstrated to the court. I would like to note that this type of self-reporting of compliance incidences is expected of the intelligence community elements and proves that oversight mechanisms are in place and that they work. Other potential legislation, including the amendments to today's base bill, would seek to permanently end Abouts communication collection. This is short-sighted and a dangerous proposition that will limit the NSA's ability to identify threat networks in the future. Rather than ending Abouts communication collection, S-139 strikes, I believe, that right balance. If NSA wants to reestablish Abouts communication collection, NSA would first need to go back to court, convince the judge that it was satisfied the court's concerns. After achieving judicial approval that NSA has made the necessary technical changes, NSA would then brief Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary committees on how they plan to reinstitute this type of collection. Barring congressional action, NSA can then start Abouts communication collection 30 days after those briefings. Some of our opponents to Section S-139 claim that 30 days is not enough. To the folks who claim that 30 days is not enough, there's nothing stopping Congress from acting after that 30-day window. However, NSA should not be penalized and America's security should not be compromised and prevented from obtaining valuable foreign intelligence information that the FISA court has deemed consistent with the Fourth Amendment just because Congress can't pass legislation in 30 days. This compromise of the bill that's on the floor today, I believe, is the right answer, and I hope my colleagues will support S-139, and I yield back my time to...
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S-875, an act to require the Comptroller General of the United States to conduct a study and submit a report on filing requirements under the Universal Service Fund programs, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make Mr. Schiff aware that we have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I would reluctantly urge that we withdraw consideration of the bill for today. I certainly have been working as hard, I think, as anyone to try to agree to a compromise that would move forward this very important surveillance authority, but would strike the right balance between our security interests and our privacy interests. But I do think we need more time to work on this bill, and I think that was only underscored this morning with the contradictory statements coming out of the administration. An issue of this magnitude and this seriousness really deserves serious and sober consideration. I think we need more time to discuss this with our members, and would urge my colleagues not to bring this to a vote today and to give us more time to work on it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
He yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close. Some of my colleagues believe that Congress should go above and beyond what is required by the Fourth Amendment and institute additional safeguards on how the government handles any potential U.S. person information that may be incidentally collected under Section 702. While the varying committees may have different ideas as to how to strike the right balance between additional privacy measures and national security, the art of the compromise brings us to the current junction. Under S-139, if the bill conducts a U.S. person query into its database during a criminal investigation not related to national security and conducts a Section 702 communication, the FBI must obtain an order from the FISA court prior to assessing the content of the communication. The committee does not believe that such an order is necessary under the Fourth Amendment, but it is adding more protections as a matter of policy in order to address unfounded concerns by opponents of Section 702 that the authority is being used to investigate U.S. people. Proponents of the U.S. Rights Act amendment will say that S-139 does not go far enough in its current form, and that they have crafted a great compromise that allows the intelligence community to do its job. Unfortunately, they are selling a poison pill that is extraordinarily harmful to our national security. Per the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, under U.S. Rights Act amendment, the FBI would not be able to look at lawfully collected data related to suspicious activities similar to that of the 9/11 hijackers. This is unethical to the 9/11 Commission report, and anyone who thinks about voting for the U.S. Rights Act amendment should pick up a copy and skim it prior to voting. Unlike the U.S. Rights Act amendment, S-139 is able to balance national security and privacy while adhering to the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission reporting. I echo the White House statement last night strongly opposing the U.S. Rights Act amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues in the House to support S-139. And I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. It is now time for the Judiciary Committee. Does the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 10 minutes to control 10 minutes, and the gentleman from New York is recognized to control 10 minutes. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize myself for a minute and a half
Gentleman's
to
recognized.
make a statement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of S-139, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act. As a former United States attorney, I know firsthand the enormous value that programs like Section 702 provide in protecting our country. Numerous threats have been thwarted due to our intelligence and law enforcement communities having tools like Section 702. Chairman Goodlatte, along with the members of the Judiciary Committee, worked diligently on legislation to implement meaningful reforms while ensuring the law enforcement and intelligence committees still had the necessary tools available. This bill includes many of the reforms from the USA Liberty Act, enhances Section 702 protections, and maintains law enforcement's abilities. I would ask all members to join me in voting yes on this legislation to implement real reforms while ensuring that we still provide the tools necessary to keep American citizens safe. And in conclusion, as a U.S. attorney, I've used this, my office used this section. We followed the law to the letter. There were no complaints. And I want the American people to realize something. We in law enforcement throughout the U.S., we have to be right and on spot every second of every day. It only takes a terrorist a moment to get lucky and set off a bomb to kill Americans. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to the FISA Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 2017, which reauthorizes Section 702 of FISA for 6 years without enacting adequate protections for our privacy. Supporters of this measure want to convince us a new, incredibly narrow warrant provision actually constitutes reform. It does not. Our right to privacy does not begin when the Department of Justice has a fully formed criminal case against us. Nor does it begin when prosecutors enter our emails and text messages into evidence against us in court. The Constitution guarantees far more than this. Our right to privacy protects us when the government first makes its decision to search our private communications for information it might find useful. S-139 falls well short of this basic guarantee. We therefore cannot, we must not support this bill. Make no mistake, S-139 is not a compromise. The Judiciary Committee, the technology companies, civil society, and other critical stakeholders were shut out of this conversation long ago. S-139 does not include a meaningful warrant requirement. The rule in this bill does not apply to most searches of the Section 702 database. It does not apply to a query for any information that, quote, could mitigate a threat, unquote, an exception that threatens to swallow the entire rule. And as a result, S-139 allows the FBI unfettered access to this information for purely domestic, non-terrorism cases without a warrant. And what does that mean in the era of Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump? It means that absolutely nothing stops the Department of Justice from trolling the database for evidence that you use marijuana, or fail to pay your taxes, or may be in the country unlawfully, or possess a firearm that you should not have. None of these cases have anything to do with the purposes of Section 702, and all of them should require a warrant based on individualized suspicion and probable cause. I agree with Chairman Goodlatte that Section 702 should be reauthorized. I understand its importance to the intelligence agencies, but neither of us should support this bill. None of us should support this bill, which pretends at reform while codifying some of the worst practices of the intelligence community in domestic crimes. When we came to Congress, each of us took an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. I ask that each of my colleagues honor that oath today, and that we work together to defeat this bill and to bring the right set of reforms to the floor without delay. I thank the Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I now recognize my good friend, the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe, for and if he goes over a little bit, that's okay.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for a minute plus.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I'm a former prosecutor, former judge. I despise terrorists. We ought to go after them and get them. 702 was written to go after terrorists, but it is being used to go after Americans. Normally, when I was a judge, I'd sign a warrant. Before the government could go into your house, they had to have a warrant to go into the house and to seize something based on probable cause. Under FISA, as it's used against Americans, forget the terrorists, used against Americans, government has already seized your house of communications, all of it. And they look around, and sometimes they go back to a secret judge in a secret court and get a secret warrant via a FISA judge, and they come in and seize something and prosecute based on irrelevant about terrorism. That's why this bill violates the Fourth Amendment. Get a warrant before you go into the house of communications and effects of papers of Americans, or stay out of that house. These documents have been seized, communications have been seized by government. They're kept forever. Keep government out without a warrant. You stay out, because government, as we learned from the British, cannot be trusted. Get a warrant. Stay out of the House of Communications. Vote against this bill. Let's redraft it and protect Americans. And that's just the way it is.
Gentleman from New York.
I now am pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, like the ranking member, I oppose this bill. It does not meet the standards that we should have for adhering to the Constitution. Now, this is a confusing debate in some ways, because people are, are we talking about? We're all against terrorism, and we've authorized the collection of data of terrorists communicating with each other. In 702, if they communicate with somebody here, we can collect that too. But because of the architecture of the Internet, we are collecting vast amounts. We can't go into the numbers here in open session. Vast amounts of data. It's not metadata, it's content. It's the content of your phone calls, content of your emails, content of your text messages, video messages, and under 702, you can search that for Americans for crimes that have nothing to do with terrorism. We should change that. As Judge Poe has said, you need a warrant to go after Americans for a non-terrorism crime. You know, there's a reason why a left-right coalition, the NAACP and FreedomWorks, Color of Change, and Gun Owners of America have come together on the same point of view. We should stand up for the privacy rights of Americans and reject this bill and have a warrant requirement for searching for the information of Americans that is in this vast database. And just one further point. The very weak predicate criminal investigation trigger for a warrant, which is at the end of the investigation, would apply only to the FBI. So if you are the ATF, you would never have to get a warrant. If you were the DEA, you would never have to get a warrant. This bill is inadequate, ought to be defeated, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Virginia seek to control the time of the gentleman from Pennsylvania?
I ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
As you all know, the Judiciary Committee worked diligently for a year on legislation that does two things. One, protect American civil liberty by requiring a court order to access Section 702 data during domestic criminal investigations, and two, reauthorize the 702 program, which is our nation's most indispensable national security tool. We achieved that by passing the USA Liberty Act in the House Judiciary Committee last year by an overwhelming bipartisan vote, which is no easy task. However, we were able to responsibly balance civil liberties with national security. The bill we will vote on today was drafted in the spirit of the USA Liberty Act. It is not perfect, and the process getting here was not ideal. but the bill requires, for the first time, a warrant to access 702 collected communications on U.S. persons in criminal investigations. Moreover, in routine criminal cases, when the FBI accesses U.S. person communications that were incidentally collected without first obtaining a warrant, the FBI will not be permitted to use those communications in a criminal prosecution. This will prevent a national security tool from advancing run-of-the-mill criminal prosecutions. These are meaningful reforms. The bill that was presented to us before Christmas with its optional warrant construct was not real reform. The bill we are debating today, however, contains meaningful reforms. I would have preferred to include additional reforms, but I cannot stress to my colleagues enough that our choice cannot be between a perfect reform bill and expiration of this program. The 702 program is far too important for that. With this bill, we can have meaningful reform and reauthorization. In its current form, this bill will pass the Senate. I also want to caution everyone that we cannot go too far in seeking to alter this program. There is an amendment that will be offered, sponsored by Mr. Amash and Ms. Lofgren, that would prevent the FBI from ever querying its 702 database using a U.S. person term. Imagine the FBI getting a tip from a flight instructor whose student acts suspiciously by expressing great interest in learning how to take off and fly a plane, but has no interest in learning how to land the plane. This could be innocent behavior, but we don't want law enforcement. We want law enforcement to at least be able to perform a search to see if they already have in their possession any communications between the student and a foreign actor involved in organizing terrorist plots. The Judiciary Committee passed bill would have allowed the search and allowed law enforcement to view the metadata without a warrant while requiring a warrant to view the content of the communications. The Amash-Lofgren amendment, which was rejected in the Judiciary Committee, goes too far and would prevent such a search from even being done. It would thus kill this critical program by preventing the FBI from even looking at its own databases without a warrant, rendering it ineffective in preventing terrorist attacks, and stifling its ability to gather necessary intelligence. It must not be adopted. I will vote to support this bill. I will oppose the Amash-Lofgren amendment, and I urge my colleagues to join me. Vote for reform and reauthorization. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, many of us are opposing this bill and supporting the amendment because it is very different from the Judiciary Committee bill that we reported, which was a good bill. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. Supporters of this bill have called it reform. This is not reform. It's a massive expansion of the government's ability to pry into the private lives of innocent people. If you need proof, just look at the bill's section 702, which is supposed to authorize spying on foreign adversaries, but it has emboldened some in law enforcement to collect and read private communications of American citizens without a warrant. Instead of curbing these practices, S-139 would codify and expand some of the most abusive surveillance practices used in recent years, including about collection and backdoor searches. There is no more important responsibility that we have than keeping the American people safe. But we have to do it in a way that is consistent with our values and our Constitution. This bill undermines our values of privacy and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. I urge my colleagues to oppose S-139 and to support the Amash-Lofgren amendment, which allows intelligence agencies to do their jobs without undermining our values as Americans. We can do both things, Mr. Speaker. Keep the American people safe and honor and respect our Constitution, which protects the privacy of all American citizens. I urge defeat of this bill and support of the amendment. And with that, I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in ensuring that a number of important reforms to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Act were included in this legislation. I rise in support of this modified version of S-139. While this does not go as far as towards reform as the USA Liberty Act did, which was passed out of the Judiciary Committee in November, the reforms that are included help to provide a more adequate balance between protecting our civil liberties and providing the intelligence community an important national tool for another 6 years before its expiration this Friday. FISA Section 702 is a critical tool used by the intelligence community to protect American citizens from foreign threats and has been successfully used numerous times to prevent terrorist plots. Since we last reauthorized this, much has changed, not only in who our foreign threats are, but also in the methods that they use against us. The bottom line is we need to protect the safety of the American people. We need to make sure constitutional protections are in place, and this is a proper balance.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Let me repeat the refrain of those of us who are members of the Judiciary Committee who have gone through this process since 9/11, and that is that we support the integrity and the importance of 702 as a national security tool, and we want it reauthorized, but we want it right. But our job and our task is also the protectors of the Fourth Amendment, and that is the protection of the American people against unreasonable search and seizure. And no matter how much my friends on the other side of the aisle argue, we know that the FBI can have the tools that it needs. But in the instance of this underlying bill, similar to the bill that was passed in 2007 by the Bush administration, of which the Judiciary Committee came back and amended it and made it a bill that provides the tools that was needed by those who are on the front lines in the United States military and the FBI, but ultimately it was changed to deny those rights. In this instance, the warrant that my friends are talking about applies only to fully predicated cases. It does not apply to the searching of documents that will have information about Americans. I ask my colleagues to postpone this. Let us work together on behalf of the American people. And who are we if we cannot uphold the Constitution? It is not protected in this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a member of the Judiciary Committee and chairman of the Crime Subcommittee.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill, and I will speak later on some of the other parts. I want to talk about the stuff that is reauthorized in this bill after the NSA itself stopped doing it earlier last year. What about collection means is that, for example, if you have two jihadists that are in Pakistan and are communicating with each other, that they didn't like something that Mr. Nadler said against jihadists, the FBI can pick up the name Nadler and go into all of his emails, all of his texts, all of the information that they have on him, and be able to see what Mr. Nadler had said about jihadists and much, much more. And that's why this bill opens the door to something that the NSA has closed itself. Now, we will hear from people who support about collection that Congress has got a chance to review it. They give us 30 days to do it. We can't get anything done in 30 days. Vote no on the bill.
Gentlemen, time has expired. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having served on active duty in the United States military, when it comes to foreign terrorists on foreign soil, we need to track them down and kill them. That's why I support the FISA Act as applied to foreigners. But unfortunately, this act has now been used to apply to Americans. And if you're going to do that, you need to follow the Constitution. You need to put in a warrant requirement. And unfortunately, the Nunes FISA bill does not do that. That's why I support the USA Rights Amendment. At the end of the day, this is not about terrorists or terrorism. It's about, can you use warrantless information against Americans in a domestic court? That's what this issue is about. Don't let the intelligence agencies scare you. Vote no on the Nunes bill, yes on the USA Rights Amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 2 minutes. The gentleman from New York has 2 1/4 minutes.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our times are this. The president is abusing his authority. He's stacking the courts with incompetent and ideological judges. He is usurping the powers of the Justice Department, the FBI. He's turning them into political animals. And at the time that he's doing this, we're considering this legislation, which leaves the door wide open for the abuse of Fourth Amendment rights of Americans. This is a bad bill for a particularly bad time. I'm asking my colleagues to vote no. We can do better than this. I'm asking my colleagues to vote in favor of the USA Rights Amendment, and if that amendment is not passed, then I ask my members to vote no on this overall bill. We can't afford to let this happen. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute to say in response to those who advocate for the Amash-Lofgren amendment that this amendment will very, very seriously damage our national security because 702, a program for which there is no evidence of abuse, used to gather information about non-United States citizens outside the United States in a targeted fashion. They have to go to the court and get approval for the selectors to gather information on a quarterly basis. They gather information. Incidental to that, sometimes there's information about United States citizens. But guess what? The information does not come with little labels attached saying this is a United States citizen communicating here, or the communication involves somebody in the United States. I will not yield. And therefore, it is absolutely vitally important that we not impair the most important intelligence, electronic intelligence gathering mechanism that the United States has to keep us safe and oppose the Amash Amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this bill that does nothing to stop the unconstitutional collection of Americans' international communications without first obtaining a warrant, and codifies the practice of indiscriminately sweeping up massive amounts of domestic communications. What makes us different from those who would harm us is our commitment to our constitutional values, that we are innocent until proven guilty, that our government must obtain a warrant and show probable cause that there is a legitimate reason to listen in on our conversations. This bill will further expose people to warrantless prosecutions or detention and deportation in cases that have absolutely no connection whatsoever to national security. I hope we reject this bill unless we approve the Lofgren-Amash amendment.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have only one speaker remaining to close. I therefore reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi, California.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. How proud I am of the House of Representatives that we have come together on the floor of the House and in our various caucuses and conferences to discuss the important challenge that we all face, the balance that we have to protect the American people. That's the oath we take to protect and defend. And as we defend the Constitution, defend the privacy and the civil liberties of the American people. It's difficult. Many years ago, over 20, I went on to the Intelligence Committee for the purpose of protecting civil liberties and privacy. Also to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, two really important overarching issues. And so I come to the floor today as one who has worked on this issue for a very long time. And I want to thank our men and women in the intelligence community for the work that they do. We're so proud of what they do. And in those days, when I went almost 25 years ago, first on the committee, it was about force protection to try to have enough intelligence to avoid conflict But if we were to engage, that we would have the intelligence to protect our forces. It was about force protection. As in the 90s, it became more about fighting terrorism and other overarching issues as well. But we live in a dangerous world, and force protection on the ground in theater is still an essential part of what the intelligence community does. And again, I thank the men and women in the intelligence community for their patriotism and their courage. The issue that relates to fighting terrorism is one that sometimes has a frightening manifestation on our own soil. But as we protect and defend the American people and the Constitution and their rights, we have to have that balance. Was it Benjamin Franklin said, if we don't fight for private security and freedom, we won't have either. I want to particularly thank our ranking member on the Intelligence Committee. He has made us all proud going across the country, honoring our Constitution, talking about undermining our election system, talking about protecting the American people in ways that is consistent with our Constitution. I thank you, Mr. Schiff, and I support you today in your support of the bill that came from your committee. Is it perfect? I've never voted for a perfect bill in this House. I also want to thank Mr. Nadler, a genius on all of these issues that relate to our Constitution, and the members of the Judiciary Committee. On intelligence, we have a very few members who are deputized by the Speaker and by the leader, each party, to go to the Intelligence Committee to deal with issues that relate to the balance between security and privacy. And with all the respect in the world for the magnificent members of the Judiciary Committee, all of whom I respect, it's not right to say there is nothing in this bill that protects the privacy of the American people. In fact, when I was supporting the Judiciary Committee bill, the outside groups were complaining. They wanted this O'Loughlin amendment. They didn't want that bill. They were complaining about it. Now today they're saying that's what they want. Well, I think that studying the issue, one of the differences along the way is when it is appropriate in terms of a warrant. That's why I'm so pleased that we will be offering a motion to recommit that addresses just that concern, which is what I'm hearing from folks about. The amendment, the motion to recommit, addresses concerns of people on both sides of the aisle, certainly in our Democratic caucus, which seeks to secure the highest possible protections for American civil liberties. At the same time, it ensures that the intelligence community and law enforcement can continue to keep Americans safe. This amendment would go a step further from the modified bill that's on the floor under consideration to ensure law enforcement secures a warrant before assessing Americans' information, accessing Americans' information. Let me repeat that. The amendment would go a step further than the modified bill under consideration to ensure law enforcement secures a warrant before accessing Americans' information. Under this amendment, the court order would be required to access Americans' data in connection with any non-national security criminal investigation by the FBI. This amendment removes predicate, that's the operational word, removes predicate standards and expands the universe of investigations that would require a warrant. A vote for this amendment, and I hope it would be bipartisan, especially from those who are objecting to the bill that's on the floor, is a vote for privacy protections and for civil liberties. We would have preferred to have this in the original bill that's coming to the floor. We couldn't get that in committee. Hopefully we can get it on the floor. Voting against the motion to recommit as a vote means fewer protections, less oversight, and more risk that Americans' rights will be violated. In the course of this, I mentioned this issue about the warrant and the rest. And I want to take the opportunity to commend the Speaker for ridding. I talked about the Judiciary bill. At the offset of all of this, the first intelligence bill, we all opposed. Supported the Judiciary bipartisan bill that was there. being criticized by some outside groups for supporting that rather than the Lofgren Amendment. But changes were made in the intelligence bill to this effect. We asked the Speaker to take out the masking provisions, which have no place in this bill. The chairman of the the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Nunes, foolishly put that in this bill. It made it a complete non-starter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for removing it. And by the way, somebody should tell the President because he thinks it's still in the bill. With that being said, I personally directed to fix the unmasking process. It isn't fixed in the bill, Mr. President. That would be a second tweet of the day, confusing matters even worse, unfortunately, because the administration, although they probably would like an extension of the status quo, understands we have to do more than that. The other provision that was in the bill was an expansion of agents of foreign governments. Agents of foreign governments opened up more people who would be subjected to surveillance. We said that doesn't fly. That has to be closed. The Speaker did that. And then on the about language, I think most people who understand that issue, or it's a complicated issue, understand that it's really not a factor in this discussion. People don't want it mentioned, but the fact is that it had to be addressed, and it is not being used, and it's unconstitutional, and until it can be proven to be constitutional, it can't be used, and when it is used, it have to go to the FISA court to get permission, and then come to Congress for ratification of that. So there are many protections there. So it's hard, I know. It's hard. I had a hard time when I was Speaker and we passed a bill to address the gross violations of Dick Cheney, of the Vice President Cheney doing the Bush-Cheney surveillance. It was appalling in my view. I considered it unconstitutional. Others did not. But nonetheless, we put in many, many protections where there were none, and then renewed and improved them when we renewed the bill subsequently in its reauthorization. So this isn't about the other side of the aisle, the other side saying, you don't care about privacy if you support this bill. It isn't about that. It's about where you strike the balance, when you weigh the equities. And we have to come down in favor of honoring our Constitution and our civil liberties, but we cannot do that completely at the expense. And I believe that the members of the Mr. Nadler understands that full well, and I commend him for his deep understanding of the vital national security issues and the invaluable work that your committee has done to strike a balance between security and privacy and has made a difference. But the choice we have today is to pass something that is not defeat this bill. Okay, you've done that if you want to do that. Pass an amendment that won't go anyplace. You can do that. And we will be left with an extension of the status quo of the current law. Being one who was participated in writing it those years ago, I understand its merit. I also understand the changes in technology, of tactics, of the terrorists who are out there, and that we have to improve the bill. I don't consider it a reform bill. It's not that vast. It's some improvements in how we can collect, protect, again, and keep the American people safe as well as protect their civil liberties. Just a couple other things about it. Since this is legislation was designed to address concerns related to the use of information collected under FISA, Section 702, an important foreign intelligence collection authority. We have to keep that emphasis on an important foreign intelligence authority. So my colleagues, to that end, this modified legislation requires a court order based on probable cause for FBI criminal investigators to view Americans' communication in the Section CO2 database and mandates an Inspector General study of 702 data. So let's keep the vigilance on, even as we go forward. It contains refined language related to about collection, requires the executive branch to secure explicit approval from the FISA court for collection. It further objects to about collections to subjects a 30-day congressional review process. I know Mr. Sensenbrenner said nobody can do anything in 30 days, but I think we can. And the bill strengthens the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. That is something I was instrumental in establishing when I was on the Intelligence Committee. I know its importance, but I also know that it has to be strengthened and it has to be respected as a watchdog. So, I mean, the list goes on, requiring public reporting on the use of 702 data, just saying to the intelligence community, don't try to minimize any violations that may have occurred. We want the facts. We want the truth. And that's why I'm so glad it has expanded whistleblower protections and briefings to the oversight committees, which we have required. Unlike the original House Intelligence Bill, which I opposed, this bill does not include language that would have likely expanded the universe of FISA targets who are now, as I mentioned before, agents of foreign policy powers, excludes the language on unmasking. Somebody tell the president. And gives me great pride in our caucus. If you could have heard the beautiful debate between Mr. Nadler and Mr. Schiff on this subject. We're not that far apart. I think that the motion to recommit addresses most of the concerns we have been getting from the outside groups and the communities that are dedicated, whose organized purpose is to protect the civil liberties of the American people. But again, with great respect for everyone's opinions and whatever they have put forth, again, saluting our men and women in the intelligence community for the work that they do. We want to be sure we strengthen their hand in terms of protecting the national security of our country, which is our first responsibility, to keep the American people safe. And as we do so, to honor our oath of office to the Constitution, to honor the principles of the Constitution. Our founders knew full well the challenge between security and civil liberties. They lived in a world when they were under attack. The War of 1812 came very soon after the establishment of our country. So this was not a foreign idea to them, and they bequeathed to us the responsibility to protect, defend, protect our liberties. And again, respectful of this debate on this issue, I myself will be voting to support my ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff, our ranking member, and members will follow their conscience on this. I just wanted you to know, from my experience in all of this and weighing the equities involved, that that's the path that I will take. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, has all time expired on the other side?
It has.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, to close for our side of the debate, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I also thank the Minority Leader for her remarks in support of the 702, and I rise in support of the 702 reauthorization. It is critical to our national security. You would see the color drain out of the faces of all of our security personnel, the entire national security community, if we lost the ability and went dark on 702. We've got to follow through in this Congress. We've got to provide the flexibility for them to use the tools that we have available to us. And we set up procedures that will approve this annually under the FISA courts. We've got a probable cause requirement for any criminal investigation that protects U.S. persons. And we don't need to be protecting anything but U.S. persons when it comes to this. The gentlelady spoke of civil liberties, and I stand in defense of those civil liberties as well, and in defense of the national security. We've got an IG report. It's written into this bill. But I would remind the people that are concerned about this focus on these civil liberties that Google and Facebook and Verizon and AT&T, they hold more data than the U.S. government has. That's where the real information is, and if they're concerned about that, they should raise that issue. Meanwhile, I'm going to oppose the Amash Amendment and support the reauthorization of 702. Our people in this America, U.S. persons, deserve that protection for national security reasons. I urge its adoption. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. All time for debate on this bill has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 115-504, offered by Mr. Amash of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 682, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash, and a member opposed each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment replaces the underlying bill with the USA Rights Act. Like the base bill, under the USA Rights Act, the government can still use Section 702 for its purpose of surveilling foreigners overseas. And the government can continue to store, share, and access that data to investigate national security threats. The key differences in USA Rights have to do with the collection and use of innocent Americans' data, not foreign intelligence. This means the amendment cannot harm Section 702 programs if, as the government says, they are designed solely for foreign intelligence, rather than domestic surveillance on Americans. We all want the intelligence community to be able to do its job, and I have offered the USA Rights Amendment to give them the tools to collect foreign intelligence while also protecting the Fourth Amendment. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this amendment, I yield myself such time as may consume. This amendment, plain and simple, would disable 702, our most important national security tool. If passed, any chance of reform through the underlying bill is dead on arrival in the United States Senate. We cannot risk 702 collection ending. This chamber cannot be complicit in allowing terrorists to fly under the radar if this amendment kills 702. And I sincerely urge you to oppose the Amash Amendment and not lose the opportunity to successfully balance national security and civil liberties, which is what the underlying bill does. We definitely need to have a move toward more protection of our Fourth Amendment rights. And a warrant requirement in domestic criminal cases, and a requirement that if you're doing a national security investigation and you find that the information is useful in a criminal case and it's precluded from court, are two major improvements to our 702 law that protect Americans' civil liberties. This bill must be passed. It is absolutely essential for our protection. It surveils people outside the United States who are not United States citizens. The fact that it collects incidental information about U.S. citizens should not be a prohibition on this effort. But if you apply this amendment, you're not going to be able to have our national intelligence officials looking at this information carefully. And they're going to have to, in many instances, get a warrant when they need to act because they think it's a national security concern. A warrant either will be unattainable or it will be in a circumstance where it's too late. And in both instances, we cannot allow that. This bill provides balance. That bill goes too far. The amendment goes too far. I urge my colleagues to oppose it and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's important that we pass this amendment. The government conducts 702 searches and broadly defined foreign intelligence investigations that may have no nexus to national security, and we are using this database for just criminal investigations that are domestic. When you say incidental collection, it sounds like it's not much. Well, the fact is it's a huge amount of data and its content. What this amendment says is, if you are going to search for the information of an American that has been collected in that database, and it's not terrorism, but domestic criminal investigation, get a warrant. Get a warrant. That's what the Fourth Amendment requires. Now, I took exception to the comment that 702 would go dark. We know that there is an existing FISA order goes through April. So the 702 program is not going dark. We have time to do this right. We have time to make sure that the Fourth Amendment is adhered to in the reauthorization of 702. Put the foreign back in the FISA bill.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I want to emphasize how dismayed I am by the amount of disinformation being propagated by opponents of Section 702. I've heard some things over the last couple of days, and I just wonder, how in the world could someone believe that? Let me tell you why this amendment must be opposed. Under the U.S. Rights Act, intelligence community would not be able to query the name of a suspected terrorist supporter in the United States to see if he's in direct contact with terrorist recruiters. It would not be able to query the name of a person in the United States who has been suspiciously approaching U.S. government employees with security clearances to determine if that person is part of a foreign espionage network. We would not be able to query the name of a registered owner of a suspicious vehicle parked in front of the Washington Monument to see if that person is in contact with terrorist operatives overseas. We would not be able to query the name of a person in the aftermath of a mass casualty attack in the United States to see if he has terrorist connections or to follow on if their potential follow-on attacks are imminent. We would not be able to query the name of a foreign national who travels to the United States to take flight training but doesn't care about learning how to land. Individuals in this room who want to end Section 02 know they have an opportunity to do that with their vote, but they would be putting troops and American lives at risk. And if that's okay with you, then go ahead and vote for the U.S. Rights Act amendment. But I promise you will regret it. When someday, in this dangerous world we live, we have to answer to our constituents for our votes here today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my amendment protects the rights of Americans consistent with the Constitution. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about terrorism. We're talking about the protection of Americans and their information. All of the rhetoric, the fear tactics that this will destroy our ability to go after terrorists is wrong. The USA Rights Act is important to protect Americans. The other side talks about protecting Americans. Let's protect their Fourth Amendment right. We can protect them against terrorists if we amend this legislation with the USA Rights Act and protect their rights under the Fourth Amendment. Every American's data is being seized by the Justice Department, the CIA, NSA. We've asked them how many times that's been queried. They will not tell us because the information is massive. And all we're saying under the USA Rights Act, if you want to go into that information on Americans, get a warrant from a judge, not a query, can't go search it, get a warrant under the Fourth Amendment, or stay out of that information and still go after terrorists under 702 and under FISA. We need to have this amendment to make the bill better to protect Americans overseas and at home. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman and rise in opposition to the amendment. I respect and share the sponsor's commitment to privacy and civil liberties, but this amendment would go vastly beyond the legislation advanced by either the Intelligence or Judiciary committees. It would prevent the intelligence community from querying lawfully collected 702 information, even in situations directly related to counterterrorism and national security. It would make Section 702 a far less effective tool at a significant cost to the national security of the United States. The amendment would require a probable cause warrant or its equivalent before the government can query lawfully collected 702 data in an effort to find communications concerning someone who may be a U.S. person or a foreign person located in the United States, even when such person is communicating with foreign terrorist or intelligence targets. Probable cause will be lacking in many, if not most, intelligence and counterterrorism contexts. In such situations, the USA Rights Act would prevent the government from detecting and disrupting plots against Americans or identifying and preventing foreign espionage on our soil. It would also require publication of information related to 702 certifications that would disclose the sources and methods of intelligence gathering, imperiling our ability to obtain foreign intelligence information. That, to me, poses an intolerably high risk. Instead, the underlying bill strikes a far better compromise. In the underlying bill, a warrant would be required in most non-national security, non-terrorism cases when there is an open investigation. In the absence of such a warrant, the bill provides that evidence that would be obtained would be excluded from use in court. That seems to me a very sensible balance, requiring a warrant in most non-national security, non-terrorism cases, and providing in the absence of such a warrant in an open investigation that information or evidence would be barred from use in court. That addresses the gravamen of the concern over this program, that it could be used for fishing expeditions against ordinary Americans. This amendment, on the other hand, would largely cripple the program, and for that reason I urge opposition to the amendment and support for the underlying bill.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, any responsible effort to authorize Section 702 must pass 3 tests. It must include a meaningful warrant requirement, it must end about collection until Congress does otherwise, and it must not restrict the government's ability to collect intelligence on valid targets operating outside the United States. The underlying bill does not include a meaningful warrant requirement, and it does not end about collection. The Amash-Lofgren Amendment, on the other hand, passes all 3 tests. It includes a warrant requirement that comports with the Fourth Amendment. It puts an end to about collection, and it leaves the core functionality of Section 702 perfectly intact. It will be harder to use this authority to spy on United States citizens, but the government's ability to gather intelligence on suspected terrorists and others overseas will not be affected. I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment and make meaningful change to Section 702, and I thank the many sponsors of this amendment for their leadership in this important fight, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ruppersberger.
The gentleman is recognized.
Yes, sir. Thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment being offered and in support of the underlying bill and the increased oversight and transparency it provides to the body, the intelligence community, and the American public that it protects. I thank the ranking member and also Chairman Goodlatte for your allowing me to have this time. First thing, I want Americans at home to know that what this program is not. It is not a dragnet surveillance program. It is not a program that can ever be used to target Americans. It is not an unchecked intelligence tool. In fact, it may be one of the most heavily overseen programs that we have. This bill strengthens that accountability. As former ranking member on the Intelligence Committee and representative of the district that is home to NSA, I have taken many of my colleagues in this chamber to trips to NSA so they can see firsthand how these programs work to protect Americans and also to protect our freedom and civil liberties. This is not a debate on constitutionality. The federal courts have affirmed that this program's current authorization and operation are legal and consistent with the Fourth Amendment. This body has voted several times with bipartisan majorities to reauthorize it. I yield back the time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me make this issue really simple for the American people. Spying on foreigners without following the Constitution, that is okay. Spying on Americans without following the Constitution, that is not okay. The Fourth Amendment does not have an asterisk that says our intelligence agencies don't have to follow it. Constitution applies to all of government. That's why I support the USA Rights Amendment, support this bill. amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this amendment. I think it's in the wrong direction, and to support the underlying bill. The bill, I think, strikes a balance. Americans cherish and strongly want us to protect their privacy. We all agree on that. And I think this bill threads the needle. The underlying bill protects our Fourth Amendment through the FISA process, through this improved effort. We know we live in a dangerous world. Terrorism is a constant threat that we all clearly understand. When we take our oath of office, we swear to protect and defend our nation from all enemies, foreign and domestic. I believe this underlying bill does that with increased transparency. Clearly, it's not perfect. We never vote on any perfect legislation. But this is an improved piece of legislation. The amendment is an overreach in the wrong direction, and I urge my colleagues to support the underlying bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When James Madison wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, one of his overriding concerns was to prevent any branch of the three in government from becoming too powerful. And that's why he put the checks and balances in the Constitution, so that the other branches could oversee and make sure that a branch that was trying to push the edge of the envelope would not be able to succeed in that. The warrant amendment that has been talked about quite a bit today during the debate really is not effective. It is nothing at all. It ends up putting James Madison's legacy into the trash bin of history, and it does not deserve to go there. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that FBI officials told aides of Mr. Nadler that under the proposed bill, meaning the underlying bill, they anticipate rarely, if ever, needing permission from the FISC to review query results. So, this warrant requirement that the supporters of the bill and the opponents of the amendment basically doesn't mean anything at all, because the FBI told Mr. Nadler's aides that that was the case. Now, we have a debate here today on whether to put the F back into the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The F means foreign, and that is why the amendment should be adopted, or if it fails, then the underlying bill should be defeated. This is a time to stand up for the oath of office that every one of us took a year ago to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The only way we can do that today is by supporting Amash and defeating the underlying bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time each side has remaining?
The gentleman from Michigan has 3 3/4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, at this time
The gentleman from Virginia has 2.5 minutes. Continue.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Wenstrup.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose the amendment and support the underlying bill. I served a year in Iraq, and every day we got foreign intelligence information to us. Why? Because it helped us prepare, it helped us plan, it helped us deter, it helped us save American lives. Not only the lives of our troops in theater, but the lives of people at home. I'm all in favor of protecting American citizens and their privacy. Do not get me wrong. I hope in the information that we collected in theater that there were no Americans involved. But guess what this amendment will do? It will virtually guarantee that terrorists are going to make sure that they have an American, complicit or otherwise, involved with every one of their communications, email or through a phone call. Why? Because that protects them. That will protect terrorists. That's what this amendment would do, and that is why I oppose the amendment and stand in favor of the underlying bill. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my amendment protects the rights of Americans consistent with the Constitution. At this time, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Amash Amendment and in strong opposition to the underlying bill. As a former Army Ranger, I know the importance of Section 702 in defeating the enemies of our country. The foreign enemies of our country are not subject to the protections of our Constitution. American citizens, however, are. The supporters of the underlying bill would have you believe that the only way to secure America is by ignoring the Fourth Amendment. And I strongly disagree. It is for American citizens, it is your data that is at subject here. The Fourth Amendment does not change when communications shift from postal service, also in the hands of the government, to a database. It should be protected by the Fourth Amendment. I strongly urge support of the Amash Amendment.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Congress has sometimes made the difficult job of the intelligence community harder by not providing adequate controls and oversight. We've created a vast Department of Homeland Security, vast security, sprawling intelligence network, results in the collection of data that my friend Mr. Poe talked about. Yes, warrants can sometimes be inconvenient, but we have judged it as a small price to pay to protect Americans from government overreach. I strongly support this amendment.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 45 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Service members in the combat zone depend on 702 to keep them safe. And 702 must continue to gather information on foreign terrorists to keep us and service members safe. However, Americans in uniform serve to preserve an ideal that the Constitution protects the rights of Americans. The bill, unamended, enshrines in law the abuse of the Fourth Amendment rights of American citizens, and it just cannot happen. This is not only about criminal prosecution, but about political persecution. Mr. Speaker, that abuse and the associated persecution is unfolding on the front pages and on TV right before us today. Don't lower the bar any further. Vote to preserve the rights of American citizens. Vote for this amendment. I yield.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time each side has remaining?
The gentleman from Michigan has 1 3/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield 15 seconds to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the patron of this amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, we've covered many things in the past year to include tax policy, health care, helping eviscerate ISIS, but I would argue this is the most important moment in the time that I have been in this building. Not only is the Fourth Amendment at stake, so too I would argue our due process under the 5th and 14th. We must stand strong for individual liberty and privacy. That is who we are as a nation. If we do not put the F back in FISA, it becomes ISA, and all eyes are on you.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Speaker, this body cannot be afraid of the Constitution. It has been our guiding moral force for this nation, for all of our beginnings and our nows. This amendment is truly an amendment that will protect and provide for the FBI to do its work and to protect our men and women around the world who are wearing the uniform unselfishly. But let me be very clear. All this amendment does, frankly, is to provide a roadmap for the FBI to utilize when it is surveying and it is using the private data of Americans. And all the amendment does is to ask the FBI and the Attorney General, where there's probable cause, that such communications provide evidence of a crime, and as well if there's a foreign power or foreign agent, to be able to utilize a warrant. And that is the protection of the Fourth Amendment. Uphold the Constitution, vote for the Amash Lawford Amendment, and let's move forward on this legislation. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to whether the gentleman has additional speakers?
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 1.5 minutes. The gentleman from Michigan has 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me pose a hypothetical about the Amash Amendment. In the criminal world, if an FBI agent is told through a tip that someone has just purchased unusual amounts of fertilizer that could be used to make a bomb, the Amash Amendment would prevent that FBI agent from looking at the FBI's databases to determine if the suspicious individual's email address or other identifier, not the content of the email, just the email address or identifier, is located in the 702 database. What would the American people say if we hamper our law enforcement from protecting them? What would people of this country say if we had another Murrah building blow up and the FBI couldn't look at even an email address? I urge you to vote against this amendment.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time each side is remaining?
Each side has 1 minute remaining.
All right, Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the underlying bill and the USA Rights Amendment present a stark choice. The underlying bill allows the government to warrantlessly collect an astounding volume of Americans' communications, makes no material reforms to the collection and use of that data against Americans, and explicitly allows even more surveillance than the law currently permits. In contrast, USA Rights allows the government to conduct broad foreign surveillance and share intelligence throughout the relevant agencies. But it also adds protections to prevent the erosion of Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. These are two very different options, Mr. Chairman. But for all of us who care about civil liberties, who believe the United States can protect itself without retiring the Fourth Amendment, and who believe Congress has an independent obligation to protect the Constitution, the choice is clear. Support the USA Rights Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, to close debate, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the Speaker of the House.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. First, I just want to say to all my colleagues, I respect the passionate views that are on display here. I think this has been a very passionate and interesting debate. What I would like to do is try and bring a little clarity to this debate. I want to thank the minority leader for coming up and speaking against the Amash Amendment and in favor of the underlying bipartisan amendment. We've been working with, on a bipartisan basis, been working with the Senate and the White House to get this right, to add even more privacy protections to the law, even more than the status quo, to add the warranty requirement that this underlying bill has. Let me try and clear up some of the confusion. There has been wide reporting and discussion here in the House about parts of the FISA statute that affect citizens. It's a big law. It's a big statute with lots of pieces. Title I of the FISA law is what you see in the news that applies to U.S. citizens. That's not what we're talking about here. This is Title VII, Section 702. This is about foreign terrorists on foreign soil. That's what this is about. So let's clear up some of the confusion here. Let me give you two examples. Two examples of what this program has done to keep our people safe. Two declassified examples. Number one, this program in March of 2016 gave us the intelligence we needed to go after and kill ISIS's finance minister because of the intelligence collected under this program, a foreign terrorist on a foreign soil, the number 2 man at ISIS who was in line to become the next leader. This program helped us get the information to stop him. I came here before 9/11. I remember hearing upon hearing in the 9/11 Commission about the old firewall We were seeing what was going on overseas. Terrorists like Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan were doing all these things, and we couldn't pass that information on to our authorities here in America. We had this firewall that prevented us from connecting the dots. That was the big phrase we used back then in the early 2000s. You pass the Amash Amendment, you bring that firewall right back up. You pass the Amash Amendment and defeat this underlying bill, we go back to those days where we are flying blind on protecting our country from terrorism. Let me give you an example. This program has not only stopped many attacks, let me tell you about one. A plot in 2009 to blow up New York's subway system. This was used to understand what people were planning overseas and what they were trying to do here in America so that we could connect the dots and stop that particular terrorist attack. That is why this has to be renewed. That is why, among many other reasons, why 702, a program designed to go after foreign terrorists on foreign soil, is so essential. If this Amash Amendment passes, kills the program. If this underlying bill fails, there's one of two things that will happen. The status quo will be continued, meaning no additional privacy protections, no warranty requirement, status quo. That doesn't do anything to advance the concerns that have been voiced on the floor, or even worse, we go dark. 702 goes down. We don't know what the terrorists are up to. We can't send that information to our authorities to prevent terrorist attacks. The consequences are really high. One of the most important things we are placed in charge to do is to make decisions not based on TV, not based on internet, based on facts, based on reality. And we're supposed to make those decisions to keep our country safe. This strikes the balance that we must have between honoring and protecting privacy rights of U.S. citizens, honoring civil liberties, and making sure that we have the tools we need in this day and age of 21st century terrorism to keep our people safe. That's what this does. That is why I ask everyone on a bipartisan basis to vote no on the Amash Amendment and vote yes on the underlying bill.
The gentleman yields. Pursuant to the rule, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended and on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash. The question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the amendment will be followed by 5-minute votes on a motion to commit, if ordered, passage of the bill, if ordered, and the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4578. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 183, the nays are 233. The amendment is not adopted. The question is on third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
An act to implement the use of rapid DNA instruments to inform decisions about pretrial release or detention and their conditions, to solve and prevent violent crimes and other crimes, to exonerate the innocent, and to prevent DNA analysis backlogs, and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am opposed to the bill in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Himes of Connecticut moves to commit Senate 139 to the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Page 4, line 3, strike predicated. Page 4, line 4, strike opened. Page 6, line 21, insert or after the semicolon. Page 7, line 5, strike semicolon or, and all that follows through line 12 and insert a period. Page 42, strike lines 15 through 19 and redesignate the subsequent paragraphs accordingly.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Intelligence Committee, of which few of us have an opportunity to serve, lead very odd lives. Every single day, we descend into the bowels of this Capitol, 4 floors down. We surrender our iPhones, we surrender our Blackberries, and we go into windowless rooms where on a daily basis we hear about some of the most grotesque threats to American safety and interests that you can imagine. Threats to American lives, threats to American interests, and threats to our very way of life. We see every day how essential 702 authorities are. The intelligence...
The gentleman is correct. The gentleman will suspend. Gentleman will continue.
Mr. Speaker, the intelligence that we gather under this authority is critical to our safety, our security, and our lives. It saves lives. This program cannot be interrupted, and if it is, God forbid, we will have much to answer for. Even if this motion fails, the base bill, to those of you with substantial civil liberties concerns, and I count myself amongst you, the base bill makes important and meaningful civil liberties improvements over the status quo. I deeply appreciate the efforts of many in this chamber that oppose this bill, the efforts that they have made. Each and every one of us swears an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and no one should ever be criticized for working hard to make sure that that process is served. Not Mr. Nadler, not Ms. Lofgren, not Mr. Amash, not Mr. Poe. Mr. Speaker, I have spent much of the last several days trying to improve this bill with respect to civil liberties. I presented amendments to the Rules Committee, which were sadly not made in order. But the fact is that these protections exist. There are strict processes and procedures in place at the FBI as to how exactly U.S. person information can be queried and used. On top of that, the entire 702 program is reviewed
by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the PCLOB, and subject to meaningful congressional oversight by each and every one of us. To authorize this program each year, a federal judge must find that it has met all statutory requirements and is consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Mr. Speaker, 3 district courts and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals have deemed this program constitutional. But, Mr. Speaker, no bill is perfect. And so the motion I offer would encompass all FBI matters, not just predicated investigations, but all FBI matters not related to national security, and require court orders founded on probable cause before the FBI could access U.S. person information under 702. My colleagues, this is a critical national security asset. It is as important as our best operator, as our best technology, as our most powerful weapons. And I appreciate the efforts that have been made to secure our civil liberties. This motion to recommit pushes this bill slightly in that direction, building on the meaningful improvements to the status quo, and I urge its passage. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Point time in opposition, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll just be really brief today. But I want to thank all of my colleagues. There are a lot of strong opinions on both sides of the aisle on this issue. And we have taken many steps at the House Intelligence Committee to take members out to the agencies that are doing this work. We've offered time for members to come down to the SCIF to read all the information. Because at the end of the day, we all take the American people's constitutional liberties seriously. And I think the robust debate that's occurred in this House over the last year on this issue through many markups, through many committees, and then even today on the floor here in the House of Representatives. It's been a tough fight because it's a tough issue. But in closing, this really is a compromise. We worked with the House Judiciary Committee for many, many months, and I can't thank Chairman Goodlatte enough for all of his very, very difficult work in trying to find a compromise. At the same time, in the House Intelligence Committee, we've worked to come to a compromise with the Democrats on the other side of the aisle. So, with all of that said, this is one of those days, if we get this bill passed, I think we can walk out of here proud that we all stood our ground for stances that we really believe in. But at the end of the day, the House is going to work its will in a bipartisan manner. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to commit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. Let's vote. The yeas are 189. The nays are 227. The motion is not adopted. The question is now on the passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is passed. And for what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
On that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring the vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 256, the nays are 164. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is a vote on the motion of the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4578, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4578.